Have you ever lived next to someone for 10 years and never really seen them? Jonathan, a cold, distant millionaire, treated his housekeeper like nothing more than a shadow in his home. But everything changed with one innocent question from Iam, his little girl. And over one elegant dinner, a truth was revealed that would change him forever. Yet what broke him wasn't someone else. It was himself. What if a housekeeper ended up teaching a millionaire the most important lesson of his life? Follow a story that reaches into the quietest corners of the soul. The Reynolds and Courage building glowed under a blanket of lights, its glass walls gleaming like the casing of a giant Swiss watch ticking in flawless precision. Inside the top-floor boardroom, everything ran just as smoothly. Speakers hit their marks. LED screens shifted scenes like clockwork, and at the center of it all stood Jonathan Reynolds, the orchestrator of this perfectly staged play. He didn't smile. He didn't have to. Success smiled for him. On the massive screen behind him, bold letters read, Jonathan Reynolds, the man who turns everything into gold. A historic signing. A multi-billion-dollar deal. Forbes was already redesigning their next cover to update the numbers. And yet, in the middle of the celebration, there was something in him, something hollow, a terrifying stillness in his eyes. It wasn't fatigue. It was the detachment of a man who'd won for so long, he'd forgotten what losing felt like. As the last round of applause faded, he pulled out his phone. No glancing at congratulatory texts. No more handshakes. Just a brief word to his assistant. Home. The black car rolled out of the city under the night sky. Inside, Jonathan sat next to Emily, his 8-year-old daughter, dozing off beside him. His polished shoe brushed the hem of her dress, but he didn't notice. He was reading an email about stocks, a 47th email in the past hour, to be exact. Suddenly, the car jerked to a halt. What happened? Jonathan's voice was sharp, eyes still locked on his screen. A cat? Cross the road, Harris, the man who had driven him for 10 years, replied quietly. Drive on. I'm afraid it might accelerate. Silence. The cat stood frozen in the headlights, trembling. In the back seat, Emily stirred awake and looked out the window. Her gaze met the terrified eyes of the animal. Harris gently reversed, giving the cat a chance to move. A soft click. Jonathan had turned off the radio. The air turned so heavy, Emily stopped breathing. Get out of the car, now. Sir? I don't pay people to hesitate over stray animals. Have you forgotten who makes decisions here? A slap made of words. No anger, just cold, immovable authority. Harris looked at him through the rearview mirror, lips pressed tight, then silently stepped out. Jonathan tapped his phone and called for a backup driver through the company app. A new car arrived in under 5 minutes. During that time, Emily, without a word, opened the door, walked out, and approached the cat. It had curled up by the curb, still trembling. She knelt down, gently picked it up, and held it close to her chest, returning to the car as if hiding a fragile secret inside her coat. Jonathan didn't notice. He was already back to his screen. The glow of the phone reflected in his eyes, cold and vacant. In his mind, time was money. Every second stalled was an invisible loss. The car sped toward the estate. Inside rode the man they called the Midas of the 21st century. A little girl cradling, a nameless cat, and a silence stretched thin like a fraying thread between father and daughter. Just as the car pulled up to the estate gates, the rain began to fall, soft, steady, more like a damp whisper than a storm. The automatic pathway lights flickered on, casting long reflections over the stone walkway, illuminating the silhouettes of Jonathan and Emily as they stepped inside. The mansion was wrapped in an expensive kind of silence, the kind that felt cold, even though everything was perfectly heated. Jonathan removed his watch and set it on the table in a mechanical motion, glancing around. No one came to greet him. Maria was usually off duty by now. Emily tiptoed out of the living room and darted off to her bedroom. Jonathan paused, watching her go. He didn't call out, didn't ask where she was headed. His mind was still scrolling through the latest market headlines. A moment later, he climbed the stairs and gently pushed open her bedroom door. The soft glow of a starry nightlight cast playful shapes onto the walls. Emily was already tucked into bed, whispering quietly to someone, not to him, to Maria. The middle-aged woman sat at the edge of the bed, still wearing her dusting gloves. Her apron was perfectly creased, silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her storytelling voice was warm like winter breath swirling above a teacup. And when the princess gave the old fairy her tattered handkerchief, the fairy smiled and said, "Kindness is the greatest magic in the world." Emily giggled. Maria brushed back a lock of her hair, her gaze full of a tenderness that made the fairy tales feel real and made it seem like Emily was the reason they existed in the first place. Jonathan stood behind the door. He didn't know how long he had been there. When Maria rose and gently pulled the blanket up around the child, he stepped into the room. "She's asleep?" he asked, his voice lower than usual, almost soft. Maria hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll stay with her a while." Maria said nothing more. She walked past him, nodding politely, and left the room like a warm, mist-en scene, but essential. Jonathan sat at the edge of the bed and let out a breath. On the small desk nearby, he noticed a sheet of A4 paper, colored in with crayon, a drawing, an 8-year-old's sketch of a house big with a crooked red roof. In the yard, 3 figures. A tall man in a suit, that was him. A little girl with brown pigtails. Emily, and between them, holding both their hands, a woman in an apron. Maria. Jonathan picked up the drawing, his brow gently furrowed. He wasn't upset, but something about it felt strange. "It's a nice picture," he said softly as Emily shifted in her sleep. "But why is Maria in the middle?" Emily didn't open her eyes, but her lips moved in the dark. "Because she's the one I love the most." Silence. Jonathan froze, his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the page. Emily rolled over, facing the wall, her voice barely a whisper. "Have you ever thanked her, Dad?" The question dropped into the room like a pebble in a still lake. No splash. But the ripples stretched far and lingered. Jonathan didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because he didn't know. In his world, gratitude toward staff came in the form of bonuses and performance reviews. "Thank you" was a sentimental phrase, soft, inefficient, not found on balance sheets. But now, hearing it from his daughter in the dark, with the scent of rain and crayon lingering in the air, he felt a sudden tightness in his chest. Jonathan placed the drawing back on the desk, stood up, and quietly left the room. The door clicked shut behind him. But Emily's question remained wide open in his mind like a silence too loud to ignore. The rain had stopped by the time Jonathan left his daughter's room. His footsteps echoed softly along the second-floor hallway, measured and steady, like the ticking of a clock in a room no one was listening to. The three-story mansion was eerily still. No footsteps from the staff, no girlish laughter from Emily. Just the low hum of the central air system and motion sensor lights tracing his path. He didn't go to his bedroom, didn't head downstairs like usual. Instead, he wandered past the living room, a space designed in modern European style, yet rarely used. Italian leather sofas sat in perfect alignment, untouched. The electric fireplace projected a carefully programmed imitation of flickering flames, a space curated to perfection, yet impossible to live in. Near the bookshelf sat a single silver photo frame, the only one in the entire house. It was a detail most people missed. Even he rarely noticed it. But tonight, for some reason, he stopped. The photo was taken 8 years ago. A younger Jonathan, his smile lighter, less calculated. Beside him, his ex-wife held baby Emily in her arms, leaning in to kiss the child's cheek. Jonathan looked toward the camera, his smile askew, his gaze slightly off. In that moment, he stood close to them, but didn't quite touch them. He brushed away a faint layer of dust, then pulled his hand back. Turning away, he approached the built-in security control panel. The screen lit up, divided into multiple sections, each showing a live feed of different areas in the house: kitchen, backyard, hallways, Emily's room. He tapped the final square, his daughter's room. The infrared camera captured everything, even in darkness. Emily lay on her side, arms wrapped around the small white cat she'd rescued earlier, her blanket pulled up to her chin. Beside her, Maria sat quietly, gently stroking the girl's hair. The look on Maria's face wasn't that of someone doing her job. It was someone being. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to Emily's forehead. Soft, barely there. And yet Jonathan could feel the room itself tremble. He stood still, a silent shadow, watching a scene that felt like a world he no longer belonged to. In that instant, he felt envy not of Maria, but of Emily, because she had something he hadn't truly known in years, a loving, unconditional touch. Jonathan turned off the screen. Not too slow, not too fast. His hand didn't shake, but the light in his eyes had dimmed, no longer sharp like when reading contracts. He walked into his office, a square room, mahogany floors, walls painted a cold beige. On the desk, his laptop remained open, stock prices scrolling across the screen. The Asian markets had just opened. The pale glow reflected in his eyes the familiar light of power. But tonight, it no longer kept him alert. He sat down and opened his inbox. A new message from a Korean partner, an invitation to a conference. The world outside was still moving fast, and he, the man who once spun that world to his will, was still Jonathan. Looked at his hands. Over the past 10 years, these hands had signed over 100 deals, hired hundreds, let dozens go, acquired stocks, lands, companies, hands that were precise, steady, cold. But now, he realized how quiet they'd become. No longer driven, no longer burning, not warm enough to hold anyone. He reached for the keyboard, ready to type a familiar command, but didn't. Instead, he pulled his hands back, leaned into the chair. A strange gesture for a man who never sat still when working. But tonight, Every algorithm inside him had crashed. In the soft glow of the desk lamp the man once hailed as the perfect investment machine sat there utterly alone, lacking nothing except life itself. Since that night sitting alone in a room flooded with lifeless light, Jonathan hadn't quite been himself, or rather, not the man he used to be. Emily's question, the image of Maria kissing her forehead, and the reflection of his younger self, caught in that silver photo frame. They clung to him like tiny cuts, sharp, and just deep enough to sting. The next morning, a light fog blanketed the city. The streets looked softened as though the haze had wrapped everything in a muted veil. Even the streetlights seemed to dim under it. Jonathan woke earlier than usual. He called the new driver and asked for the car to be ready. Strangely, he wasn't going to the office. Maria was dusting the stairs on the second floor when he approached. He stood there for a moment. She looked up, sensing his presence, the kind of instinct built from years of working in homes too big to feel inhabited. "I was thinking we could have dinner together tonight." "Somewhere nice?" Jonathan said, his voice missing its usual sharpness. Maria looked slightly surprised, then gave a soft nod. "Shall I prepare dinner as usual?" Jonathan shook his head, lightly. "No, I meant out at La Lumiere." Maria froze mid-movement. Her eyes blinked not in shock but in uncertainty, as if unsure how to read the words. "I'm not exactly on their regular guest list," she said softly, half joking. "You don't need to be," he replied. "You're someone I want to thank." He turned. 10 o'clock. The car will be waiting." He didn't leave room for her to say no. La Lumiere sat in the heart of the city's financial district, where billion-dollar figures took the form of handbags, leather shoes, and silk gowns. A place where women wore nothing cheaper than someone else's monthly salary, and glances were as chilly as the elevator air. Jonathan walked ahead with purposeful strides. Maria followed, hand gripping the strap of her old purse. She'd never seen so much glass and gold in one sealed space. "I don't need anything, sir," she murmured. Jonathan didn't turn. "I know, but I need you to have something that fits." They entered a high-end Italian boutique. The saleswoman's hair pulled into a sleek bun, heels sharp as her gaze assessed Maria with the ease of someone trained by thousands of customers, classification on sight. "We've just received the new Milan collection. Would you like a suggestion?" "Whichever's the best, that one," Jonathan said curtly. The woman led them to the display area. Tulle, lace, silk, satin, shades of nude, pearl, slate gray, an orchestration of fabric that made Maria instinctively want to step back. She had never tried on a dress worth 3 months' wages. Never thought she'd need to. But what unsettled her more wasn't the price, it was the eyes. The eyes of the saleswoman, the other customers. The quiet gazes that studied her like a misplaced object in a well-curated gallery. No hostility, just a discomforting clarity, like being examined under a too honest light. Maria picked up a dress. Her hands trembled just slightly. Her eyes met Jonathan's. He stood diagonally across the room, arms crossed, giving her a small nod that said, "Go ahead." In the dressing room, the lights were a touch too bright. Maria slipped into a teal silk dress that fell just below the knees. Modest, simple, not revealing, but it wasn't her. When she stepped out, Jonathan was waiting. He didn't smile, just nodded. "It works." Maria looked in the mirror. The lighting hadn't changed, but her face had something about it unfamiliar. Not because of the fabric, but because she didn't belong inside it. "This dress, it's expensive," she said quietly, as if trying to hold on to something plain and honest. "You wear it well. I'll take care of the rest." He said it like closing a deal, and that was the problem. Maria nodded, but as she turned back toward the fitting room, her eyes paused not at her reflection, but at the man behind her. She saw it clearly now. Jonathan was doing the right thing, just the wrong way. She was still just another task to cross off his list of well-intentioned efforts. Night had fallen. Soft light from motion sensor lanterns glowed against the villa's glass panels, casting gentle streaks like the house itself was breathing in quiet sleep. Emily was fast asleep upstairs. In her room, the little white cat curled. Beneath a thin blanket, its breathing slow and steady, an innocent creature, unaware it had helped shift the world of a man who once believed his world unshakable. Jonathan made his way slowly to the kitchen. He was still in his dark suit, though his tie was loosened. His hair was slightly tousled, and his stride had lost its usual authority. Something about him felt paused. Warm, overhead light spilled over the marble counter. There, Maria stood rinsing the last dishes of the day. She didn't turn at the sound of his footsteps, not because she didn't notice, but because she was used to his presence requiring no acknowledgement. But Jonathan didn't speak right away. He stood still, fingers trailing absently along the cold marble. Under the lights, his face no longer wore its usual mask. There was something there, wariness, not from work, but from consideration. For the first time in years, he was weighing his words before speaking to someone outside his world. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low but clear. "Are you free tomorrow night?" Maria paused. She turned, calm but cautious. The space between them remained an invisible distance shaped by years of silent boundaries. "Would you like me to prepare dinner for a guest, sir?" Jonathan shook his head slightly. This time he looked down at the counter as though choosing his words carefully. "No, I'd like to take you out to dinner. A proper one." The words landed softly, but their impact echoed. The room seemed to still. Maria froze, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. For a second, she studied him, as if trying to determine who exactly was standing before her, because those words didn't sound like Jonathan Reynolds. "You don't need to do that, sir. A thank you is enough," she said, her voice as quiet and steady as always. Jonathan exhaled, not out of frustration. It was the breath of someone, realizing something inside him had shifted. Some things can't be said with just words. Silence, not uncomfortable, just the kind that lives between two people who've never truly spoken. Maria slowly dried her hands on a cloth, her gaze dropping, then rising again, not to meet the eyes of a boss, but of a man still learning how to step out of his own shadow. "La lumière," she said softly, lips curling into the faintest smile. "I heard they don't serve mashed potatoes." Jonathan let out a small laugh, the first real one. No politeness, no defense, no calculation. "I'll have them make it, just for you." Maria didn't respond right away. She nodded gently, not just to the invitation, but to the quiet change she had begun to feel in him. Jonathan turned to leave, but this time, his steps were lighter. Not because he felt at ease, but because a part of his ego had been set down. And Mariage turned back to the sink, setting the cloth aside. She didn't continue her work. She just stood there a while longer, hands still warm from the water, but her heart chilled by a vague sense of knowing. When men like Jonathan begin to show kindness, they often believe they're offering something, but sometimes they're the ones in need of saving. The night wind swept between the high-rises, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and the hurried footsteps of people who never allowed themselves to slow down. The long black car rolled to a silent stop in front of La Lumiere's most prestigious French restaurant in the city, where every table was booked at least a week in advance, and every glance held layers of unspoken meaning. Jonathan stepped out first, his coat tailored to perfection, his demeanor effortless, like he had belonged to this world since birth. The doorman bowed slightly. Jonathan returned a small nod. No smile necessary. The car door opened. Maria stepped out. The soft teal dress wrapped gently around her frame, not attention-grabbing, but enough to make her feel out of place. Her shoes were new, unfamiliar. The streetlight reflected off strands of silver in her hair. She wore no makeup. Only her eyes were honest, and at this moment they searched uncertainly, unsure where to look. Jonathan extended a hand. Maria didn't take it. She offered a faint nod instead, then stood beside him, polite distance intact. Not too far, not too close, just enough for the boundary to be obvious to anyone watching. Together, they stepped inside. La Lumiere was like walking into a living oil painting. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers casting warm, dignified light. Every table a miniature stage, where silk gowns and tailored suits performed with glances and gestures. A string quartet played a soft adagio in the corner. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed too hard. Everything wrapped in a polished kind of cold elegance. Maria moved slowly. Her unfamiliar heels wobbled slightly with each step. She felt unsteady, not just in her shoes, but in her presence. Unsure whether to walk straight, to smile, or simply to turn back. A couple passed by. The woman glanced at Maria, head to toe not with overt disdain, but with the kind of look trained to identify difference in fabric, posture, and hair. The gaze wasn't cruel, just surgical and academic assessment of who belonged and who didn't. Maria clenched her hands just slightly. A quiet signal that she was trying to steady herself. Jonathan didn't look back, but when they reached the table, he did something he had never done before. He pulled out a chair for her. "Please," he said. Maria froze for a moment, not because of the gesture, but because after all the years of wiping down tables and straightening chairs in his house, this was the first time she was being invited to sit. She sat slowly, carefully, as if afraid to misstep. Jonathan took his seat across from her. The waiter approached with menus, bowing slightly, then hesitated, unsure who to hand it to first. Jonathan gave a subtle nod toward Maria. The waiter adjusted seamlessly. She took the menu. Elegant French words spread across the page like a forest of phrases, not meant for her. Every dish unfamiliar. Every price intimidating. "What should I order?" Maria asked quietly, leaning toward him. "Pick anything that sounds strange to you," Jonathan replied, a hint of humor in his voice. Maria smiled faintly. But it wasn't joy. It was the smile of someone who knew deep down that she was stepping into a world never designed with her in mind. The violin played on. The wine kept flowing, but that feeling of being out of place, though no one dared name it, was the loudest thing in the room. The violins played on, their notes gliding through the gold-trimmed air, each one seemingly hand-picked to match the delicate cadence of La Lumière. Maria sat with her back straight. Not stiff, but not quite at ease either. The soft teal dress framed, her figure making her stand out in a way she never wished for, like wearing a second skin that didn't belong to her. On the table, 4 forks lay evenly on either side of an ivory porcelain plate. Knives, spoons, glasses, everything arranged with the precision of soldiers at a silent banquet. To Jonathan, it was standard. To Maria, it was a maze. She glanced around, studying the other tables. People dined without looking down at their plates, poured wine without glancing at the label, smiled, but their eyes never left their companions. She lowered her gaze, carefully lifting the smallest fork toward the appetizer slice of truffle pâté. But her hand trembled slightly. The fork tapped the plate with a quiet clink barely audible, yet enough for the table beside them to turn. 2 middle-aged women draped in Chanel and Louboutin stilted their heads, whispering behind practiced smiles. One of them gave Maria a slow, lingering glance, followed by a half smirk. The other leaned in, not bothering to whisper quietly enough, "Must have won the lottery." Soft laughter, not loud, but perfectly pitched to be overheard. Jonathan looked up. His ears never missed what wasn't meant to be heard. His eyes locked on them for a few seconds. No scowl, no gesture, but his breathing slowed. He said nothing. Not because he wasn't angry, but because he was torn. Speak up, or preserve the image. Maria didn't turn. She had heard. Of course she had, but instead of reacting, she smiled. Faint, almost invisible, smile. The kind that closes a sentence rather than starts one. She set the fork down, realigned it neatly, and calmly picked up the correct knife. Her movements were steadier now, more assured, unhurried, unapologetic. Without needing anyone to correct her, then she turned to Jonathan, her gaze soft. "They make a lovely French onion soup here, don't they?" Jonathan nodded, but his expression was no longer detached. It was warming, and tinged with something quietly ashamed, because he, more than anyone, had once been that kind of person. The kind who smirked silently. Maybe not aloud, but in thought. The waiter approached to pour wine. Maria reached for the bottle, trying to serve herself, but accidentally poured white wine into the glass meant for red. A few drops slipped over the rim. "Oh," she murmured, then gently dabbed the spill with a napkin. Not a drop left behind. A brief moment of awkwardness. But only for a moment. Maria smiled, glancing at Jonathan, her eyes laced with dry humor. "I've never had 2 kinds of wine with dinner. At home, it's just tea and tap water." Jonathan didn't speak, but something dropped inside him like a pebble into a still, too quiet lake. Not because she'd said anything wrong, but because he'd never asked, never wondered what she drank, what she ate, what she liked. In the hundreds of meals she had prepared for him, he'd never once asked where she ate her own. The air softened again, but something had shifted. Amid the murmurs, the glances, the small slip-ups, Maria remained composed, like a silk dress that never creased, even under scrutiny. And Jonathan began to understand. Kindness doesn't live in a silver fork. The tension that had filled the restaurant earlier had now eased. The violin shifted into a slower melody, as if gently syncing with the breath of someone still trying to find their rhythm in a world too distant from their own. Maria dabbed the corners of her mouth with her napkin, her eyes sweeping across the room. The visible unease had faded, but her posture still carried something held back, a cautious grace, ingrained from years of living at the bottom of every hierarchy. Jonathan poured more wine into her glass, a simple gesture, yet it was the first time he'd ever done it not as a host, but as an equal. He didn't know that even that small act made Maria's heart tighten, just for a beat. "This pairs well with the entree," he said, tilting his glass slightly. "I'll take your word for it," Maria smiled. At that moment, a deep voice rose from the table behind them. "Excuse me, would you happen to be Maria Dawson?" Maria turned. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by a smile, not the polite kind, not one meant for strangers. A real smile. The kind that blooms when someone reminds you that your past was once something worth remembering. "Professor Blake," she said softly, warmly. The man wore a tasteful brown suit, silver hair combed neatly, sharp eyes behind round-rimmed glasses. His face lit up with recognition. "My God, it is you. I couldn't be mistaken. You taught my English Lit class in college. My first essay on Macbeth came back covered in your red ink." Maria laughed light, unforced, as if the scent of chalk dust and old library books had just returned to her. Jonathan froze mid-pour. His wine glass hovered halfway in the air. He turned, eyes locking on them. "Maria, you were a teacher?" he asked slowly. Maria nodded, not with pride, not with shame, just with the quiet truth of someone saying, "I lived another life once. A long time ago. A different life." Arthur turned to Jonathan and extended a hand, polite, steady. "Arthur Blake. I'm a professor at St. Julian's University. Actually, Jonathan, I believe we met at a finance summit a few years ago." Jonathan shook his hand not firmly, but not faintly either. His confusion wasn't in his words, but in his gaze, which remained fixed on Maria. Arthur continued, turning back to her, his voice tinged with reverence. "She didn't just teach, she inspired. Our whole class still talks about Professor Maria Dawson like she was a legend. Are you still teaching?" Maria shook her head, the corners of her smile softening into something quieter. "No. Life has a way of turning. I took a path less traveled, and I'm still walking it." A silence fell. Jonathan said nothing, but his eyes had changed. In that moment, Maria was no longer the housekeeper of many years. No longer part of the background, the walls behind the kitchen. She had once stood at the blackboard, held a piece of chalk, taught Shakespeare, inspired a student who remembered her decades later. And perhaps what struck Jonathan most wasn't that Maria used to be a teacher. It was that he had never thought to ask. An entire world had existed beside him, inside his very home, and he'd never once seen it. Arthur excused himself with a final word of heartfelt thanks. Maria nodded, her eyes following him for a moment before, returning to her plate, Jonathan remained silent. But this time, it wasn't because he had nothing to say, it was because there was too much to think about. Arthur's footsteps faded into the background, blending with the soft hum of violins like the closing of an old door that somehow opened a new one inside Jonathan. No one spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. They shouldn't. Maria returned to her plate, continuing her meal as if nothing had happened. But Jonathan knew her silence wasn't due to a lack of things to say. It was because the past didn't need explanation. It only needed respect. He looked at her a little longer now, not with the gaze of an employer, not as a successful man treating someone who'd once been beneath him to dinner, but with the eyes of someone who had just been given their first real lesson, the lesson of recognizing the limits of their own understanding. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter than usual. "You were really a literature professor?" Maria didn't look up right away. She cut a small piece of fish, brought it to her mouth, chewed slowly. Then she answered, her tone calm, like she was simply talking about the weather. "I taught for 10 years at St. Julian's University. Classical literature, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Woolf. I loved language the way some people love the changing seasons." Jonathan said nothing. "Then why—" He paused, then continued. "Why did you choose to become a housekeeper?" Maria looked up. Her eyes held no anger, no bitterness, but something in them made Jonathan feel small, like a child who had just asked a question too careless to understand. She set her knife and fork down. "My husband died in an accident. A truck ran a red light. He was a music teacher at a public school. Silence. Simple. No dramatics." Her words landed like a blank sheet of paper, no blood, no tears, but heavy all the same. "We had a son. He was 4 at the time. I needed any work that could help me raise him. Teaching didn't pay enough to survive. Cleaning homes did. It allowed me to feed him, to send him to school." Jonathan stared at her. A part of him wanted to ask more, but a deeper part, wiser, told him not to. Sometimes, listening is the only way not to wound someone's dignity. But Maria smiled, as if she knew what he was thinking. "Not everyone gets to do what they're good at, but I've lived honestly, and I think that's enough." Her voice was steady, not meek, not apologetic, and in that moment, Jonathan sat up straighter, not out of posture, but from a rising sense of respect for the woman sitting across from him. It struck him over the past 8 years he'd never asked about her past, never considered she might have had a before. In his mind, Maria had always been the quiet woman who cleaned the staircase well, never complained, and only now did he realize the quietest people often carry entire lives in their silence. He gave a small nod, as if in place of an unspoken apology, but Maria simply smiled, lifted her water glass and said, "We should eat while the food's still warm. One of the simple things I try to hold on to no matter where I am or what I do." Jonathan smiled. For the first time that evening, not out of politeness, not out of obligation, but because he felt deeply, gratefully moved, and for the first time, he realized he wasn't the one giving anything in this conversation. Dinner was more than halfway through. The clink of a spoon on porcelain echoed gently, blending with the soft nocturne from the violins like a lullaby for a night heavy with reflection. Jonathan took a sip of wine, not out of thirst, but to buy himself a moment to hold back the cold wave of thought that had just swept through him. Across the table sat Mariatha, woman he thought he'd known for 8 years, yet had only truly met tonight. A young waiter approached, glass pitcher in hand, silently refilling Maria's water. His movements were smooth, practiced, quiet. Maria looked up. "Thank you," she said softly, light as a breeze but with the weight of someone who's learned to treasure the smallest things. The waiter hesitated, then gave a brief nod. Perhaps he wasn't used to being thanked by someone who looked like her. Jonathan watched. For a moment, the chandelier's reflection glinted off his own glass of water, casting flickers of light across his face like a small mirror angled straight at him. and he saw eat, face composed, commanding, and empty. He suddenly remembered. A few weeks ago, a new employee had come to his desk after completing their first project, handing over a report with a hopeful smile. "Thank you for trusting me." Jonathan hadn't responded, just flipped, opened the report, nodded once, and said, "Make a backup version." At the time, he believed he was teaching the kid responsibility. Now he saw it differently. He had crushed something deeply human. Snapping back to the present, Jonathan noticed the same waiter still standing nearby. He reached for his water glass. "Thank you," he said, not loud, not crisp, but slow, low, as if speaking an old language he'd never learned to use. The waiter turned, visibly surprised. Jonathan nodded again, this time firmer, and the young man returned it with a quiet smile that caught the light. Maria looked at him. She didn't say anything at first. Then, as if to break the silence before it grew too wide, she spoke. "Gratitude is an action, not a habit. It only means something when it's freely given." Jonathan looked up. Her words weren't a lesson, but they landed like truth, and it hurt, just enough to change something. Dinner continued, but he no longer led the conversation. He listened, truly, listened for the first time. Maria shared small stories about the garden behind the estate, about the lavender she'd grown from seed, about the spring last year when Emily had drawn her a crooked, colorful picture. Jonathan smiled, not because the stories were extraordinary, but because he felt lucky to be hearing them. The chandelier still shimmered above. But now, he no longer looked at the light. He looked at the mirror across from him, and for once, it was facing the right way. Some changes don't arrive with explosions. They come in a glance. A drop of water. A quiet, well-timed thank you. If small things like that have ever changed you, follow the pages. You never miss the moments that speak to what's most human in all of us. Dinner was nearing its end. The wine glasses held only a few final drops. The candle on the table had burned down to just above a fingertip. The restaurant lighting had softened like the slow, steady breath of a late-night jazz tune, leaving behind lingering notes, tender and low. Jonathan sat still, his hand resting loosely on the arm of the chair. He wasn't in a rush to leave. Not for dessert, not out of politeness, but because, for the first time in his life, he was listening. Not for work, not for tactics, but for something profoundly human, unfolding right before him. Maria had quietly excused herself to walk near the tall glass windows, where a few pots of lavender sat planted in Italian ceramic. There, an older waiter likely past retirement age was tidying cutlery at the empty tables. His back was slightly hunched, hair salt and pepper, hands trembling faintly each time he lifted a crystal glass. Maria paused beside him. Not to instruct, not to correct. Just to ask a question. The man looked up, and his face broke into a rare smile. They stood there, speaking like old friends in a lavender-scented garden built of warm lighting and essential oils. Jonathan couldn't hear what they said, but he saw what mattered. Maria's eyes did not change, whether she was speaking to a professor or a man clearing tables. No judgment, no condescension, no performative kindness. Just respect. The old man laughed aloud. Maria chuckled with him. The sound was small, yet enough to make a nearby table turn and smile without knowing why. No one complained. No one thought it strange. The warmth in their eyes had made the entire restaurant feel a little more alive. Jonathan remained seated, watching, and, in his mind, a question surfaced no one had asked. How long has it been since I looked at someone that way? Without measurement, without motive, without calculating what they could give me. Just because they exist. When Maria returned to the table, the ceiling light caught her shoulder, casting a quiet gold across the tablecloth. She sat, her hand resting near her glass. At that moment, Jonathan noticed something. A brief glance she cast upward, toward the staircase. He knew what was up there. Emily, asleep. Maria didn't say a word. It was just a glance. A silent good night. A moment of tenderness sent through nothing but her eyes, no expectation of being seen or returned. Jonathan froze, a sharp breath pressed against his chest like cold air rushing into lungs that hadn't drawn deeply in years. He'd lived with his daughter for 8 years, but he had never once looked at her like that. He had provided, he had protected, he had ensured every need was met, but never loved her quietly, gently, without condition like that. His throat tightened. He stayed silent, but inside something long frozen had begun to crack. Not because Maria had said something profound, but because she hadn't needed to say anything at all. She simply was. Through her presence, through her gaze, through her quiet dignity. Jonathan lowered his head, fingertips brushing the edge of his water glass. To drink, but to touch something he thought he'd lost long ago. Something still alive. The music in the restaurant had shifted to a softer piano melody. The atmosphere mellowed, making room for conversations that were quietly winding down. Guests began leaving in small groups. Laughter floated gently through the room, and good nights were exchanged in the hushed, measured tones of people well versed in the art of social decorum. Jonathan leaned back slightly, lifted his water glass to his lips, but didn't drink. His eyes remained on Maria, who was still engaged in quiet conversation with the elderly waiter. Her face was calm, warm, as if the only thing that mattered in that moment was the person standing in front of her. It was just then that a familiar voice rose behind him. "Jonathan! Who else would it be? Still sharp as ever, huh?" Jonathan turned. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a sleek gray suit approached, lavender tie matching the silk pocket square in his chest. His face was confident, his eyes scanning quickly, trained by years of conferences and galas, where every handshake came with a price tag. "Edward," Jonathan greeted him, standing to shake his hand. His smile was polite, his grip firm just enough. "It's been a while." Edward patted his shoulder, then tilted his head toward Maria just long enough to register her presence. And then, like a swift visual scan, he moved right past her as if she'd been a piece of decor. Not with contempt, just non-existence. "Business tonight? Or is this the debut of a new taste?" Edward grinned, a half-joke laced with implication, his words wrapped in silk, but still sharp at the edges. Jonathan hesitated just a beat, then replied, "It's a dinner of gratitude. Not business, not a date." Edward raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicked back to Maria, this time with a tinge of suspicion he didn't bother to hide. Then he changed the subject quickly, like stepping over unfamiliar ground. "Anyway, just opened a new resort in Aspen. 5-star service, top-shelf wine, views that kiss the snow. Come out for golf this weekend. My treat." Jonathan gave a faint smile, but this one didn't reach his eyes. think about it." Another pat on the shoulder, and Edward turned to leave. No goodbye for Maria. No glance back. Just the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. Jonathan remained standing for a moment, then slowly sat back down, fingers laced. He said nothing. His eyes settled on the space between their water glasses, where the overhead light cast a long, thin line of reflection like a hairline crack across the table. Maria stayed still. Her gaze held no accusation, no offense, just the quiet air of someone long accustomed to being unseen. She didn't need to push back against it to survive, and that was what hit Jonathan in the throat. He spoke low, slow. "I used to be Edward." Maria tilted her head slightly, still watching her glass. "No, you're Jonathan. Edward was just a costume you wore. The question is, do you still want to keep the mask?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. His mind replayed boardrooms, lavish cocktail parties, the theaters of men like Edward, where conversation was choreography, and women without designer labels were mistaken for waitstaff. He had played his role, lead actor, never missed a line. Now, sitting across from a woman he once never saw beyond the kitchen doorway, the mask felt heavier and cracking. Maria turned to him. Her eyes saw deeply but didn't press. "No one's forcing you to change, but just know, every time you stay silent when someone's made invisible, you add another mirror around yourself. Eventually, you won't see anyone else. And you won't see yourself either." Her words weren't dramatic, not scolding, but they sank into him like a stone into deep water, quiet and final. Jonathan leaned forward, bracing on the table slightly. "I spent my whole life trying to be the man who stands at the center of the room when Edward walks in. But now I realize, the people worth remembering are standing at the edges, and I've never looked their way." Maria smiled. She said nothing, because she knew the most important thing that needed to be said had just come from him. The automatic gate opened just as the warm yellow porch light poured down like a soft blanket over the stone steps. The sleek black car came to a smooth, silent stop. Jonathan stepped out first, his face pensive, and quietly walked around to open the door for Maria. She stepped out gracefully, her posture upright, though her steps were slightly slower than usual. The teal dress still held its shape, but in Maria's eyes the night had passed like a dream she had no desire to relive. The front door opened before either of them could reach for it. Emily Small, bright-eyed, hair in twin braids, rushed out like a gust of wind, clutching the white cat in her arms. "Miss Maria!" she squealed. Maria knelt down, welcoming the little girl into her embrace. Emily held on tightly, as if afraid Maria had just returned from a world she couldn't understand. "Did you eat cake? I heard fancy places have giant cakes," Emily asked, her voice full of wonder. Maria laughed softly, running a hand through her hair. "I prefer small cakes just enough to enjoy, and still leave room for the next good thing." "Did you like the restaurant?" Emily tilted her head, her eyes wide with that fairy tale hope for a magical answer. Maria paused, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she didn't want to hurt a child's beautiful belief. Her gaze drifted briefly toward Jonathan, still standing quietly behind Emily, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The warm light from inside illuminated half of his face. The other half lay in shadow. "I liked being with both of you," Maria said gently, her eyes on Emily. "As for the restaurant, She exhaled not a sigh, just breath carrying the truth of the heart. It was a beautiful fairy tale, just not mine. Emily frowned a little. But I saw you sitting at a pretty table, wearing a pretty dress. Maria nodded, her smile soft. Yes, sweetheart. But you see, in fairy tales, not everyone is a princess. Some people are just the ones who set the table, then quietly disappear before midnight. Emily thought for a moment, then whispered, But if I were the princess, I'd let you stay at the party forever. Maria pulled her close, voice thick with emotion. Thank you, love. I stayed tonight not because of the pretty dress, but because of you. Jonathan still hadn't spoken. He stood silent, but his eyes had grown darker, more reflective. Though Maria had spoken to Emily, her words struck him like a mirror turned inward. All evening, he had done everything to honor her. But in the end, it was Maria who made him feel like the one seeking forgiveness, not for something he had done wrong, but for the hollowness behind his well-meant gestures. He stepped forward, then stopped. In the porch light, his face was fully visible, and for the first time, there wasn't a trace of the boss. Maria rose, still cradling Emily in her arms. The little girl had already dozed off, her head resting on Maria's shoulder, murmuring sleepily about cake. Maria spoke softly without turning around. People don't need to be invited in to feel they belong. They just need to be seen. Jonathan nodded, not with words, but in his eyes. A promise to truly see, to the very end. The porch had settled into an uncanny stillness after a long night. Garden lanterns cast a soft glow over the stone path, and the shadows of trees stretched long and swayed gently with the wind. Jonathan sat on the wooden bench beneath the awning. The porch light touched one half of his face, the other half lay in shadow, as if he hadn't quite stepped out of the version of himself he used to be. Maria came out a few minutes later. She carried nothing with her, just leaned quietly against the doorframe, as if waiting for the night breeze to help her breathe out what couldn't be said aloud. "Emily's asleep," she said softly. Jonathan nodded. "You always know how to make her feel safe." Maria offered a faint smile. Silence passed between them, slow and heavy, as if every second had a weight. Jonathan turned toward her, his eyes hesitant like he was searching for the right words in an overstuffed drawer. "Tonight, I've been thinking. A lot." Maria didn't respond. She simply sat beside him, placing her hands gently on her lap, and waited. Jonathan went on. "I've been meaning to say something for a long time, but I never knew how. Maybe because I didn't know how to say it right." "Say it the way you feel it," Maria replied. "I want you to stop working." Maria turned to him, but there was no surprise in her eyes. Jonathan rushed to explain as if afraid she'd misunderstood. "I mean, I want you to stop so you can live better. I'll take care of everything. A house, a pension, insurance, a car, if you need one. I can arrange it all." Maria was silent. He continued, sincerity written all over his face. "You've spent your middle years taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to live for yourself. You deserve kindness and a life without worry." After a long moment, Maria finally spoke. Her voice was steady, not loud, but every word felt placed with the weight of lived experience. "You know, what moved me most tonight wasn't the meal, not the restaurant. It was the way Emily looked at me." "I saw that," Jonathan nodded. Maria shook her head gently, then said quiet but clear, Because in her eyes, I had worth. Not because of what I did, but because I was simply me. Not someone to be helped, not someone to be provided for, just someone who was loved and seen. Jonathan exhaled quietly. I thought I was doing something good. I'm not denying that, Maria said gently. Your intention was kind. But you see, sometimes kindness without understanding becomes a quiet insult. Jonathan looked up. When you said you wanted me to live like a lady, I couldn't help but feel like I was being cast back into the same image society often uses to reward the obedient poor. You want me to be happy, but by your definition, not mine. Jonathan nodded slowly, his lips pressed tight. Maria went on this time, deeper. I used to be a professor. I had a classroom. I stood at a lectern. When my husband died, I gave those things up, not because I wasn't capable, but because life demanded I walk a different pace. But I never gave up my dignity. She looked him straight in the eyes. And Jonathan, what I need isn't to be rescued from this life. What I need is someone who understands that this life doesn't need rescuing. There was a long pause before Jonathan finally whispered, I'm sorry. Maria met his gaze, unblinking. I don't need an apology. I need you to stop seeing me as a charity project. Jonathan's voice faltered. I've seen it all wrong for far too long. Maria stood then, slowly, her voice gentle but firm. I'll continue working if you need me, but not for the paycheck, because I know there are still people who need to be reminded that dignity doesn't come from a checkbook or promises of comfort. It comes from the way we look at one another every single day. Jonathan watched her walk inside. The glass door clicked shut behind her. No sound, but inside him everything shook. The villa had sunk into a strange, aching quiet after the long night. The wind had died down. The wall clock in the living room ticked steadily, as if counting down to a moment that would forever shift something inside a man. Jonathan walked the upper hallway, each step triggering soft motion sensor lights that spilled golden light onto the polished wooden floor. There was no trace of his usual command in the way he moved. Just slightly slumped shoulders, slow footsteps, and a face so heavy with silence no one would dare call it the face of a successful man. He stopped outside the bathroom door. Hand on the knob, he turned it gently. The light clicked on. The room lit up, cold and pristine, so clean it felt sterile. A large mirror stretched across the wall above the sink, reflecting his image back at him, hair still neatly in place, tie undone, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He turned on the faucet, cupped his hands, splashed water onto his face. Reflex, muscle memory from countless nights after work. Then he looked up, and he saw himself, not the powerful man the press had praised, not the master of finance whose name lived in billion-dollar headlines, just a tired face. Profoundly tired. Sunken cheeks. Faint shadows beneath his eyes. But what stopped him cold, what held him there was the look in his own eyes he had used to scan others his entire life, yet had never turned inward with any true intention. Now they stared back at him, and seemed to ask, "Are you sure? You've been living right?" Jonathan gripped the edge of the sink. His palms were cold, and then like film running in reverse memories surged, wild and uninvited. Maria, Her voice. I don't need to be provided for. I need to be respected. Not loud, but each word pierced the armor he still hadn't realized he wore. Emily. Did Miss Maria like the restaurant? It was a beautiful fairy tale, just not meant for her. Edward. The hollow handshake, the glance that skimmed past Maria as if she were air, the smirk of men who had once been his kind, and Maria again, saying thank you to the elderly waiter with an honesty in her eyes Jonathan had never once offered a stranger, without a title. All of it rushed in, tangled, out of order, like a painting turned upside down, suddenly, finally, seen right side up. Jonathan lowered his head over the sink. His breath grew heavy. No one saw it, but something inside him had cracked open. He looked up again. The mirror still held his reflection. Still Jonathan, still the same. But this time, it couldn't lie to him anymore. He raised a hand, touched the glass. Ice cold. His fingertips moved to his cheek. He felt the moisture, not from the faucet, but from somewhere deeper. A single drop landed in the porcelain sink, then another. He didn't sob. He didn't collapse like some scripted tragedy. He simply stood there, coming undone. Quietly. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was something harder to name. A slow, searing realization. He had lived a life that was full, and yet unbearably empty. Full of wealth, full of acclaim, but empty of people, empty of connection, empty of unconditional love. A slight tremble passed through his shoulders. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his forehead against the mirror. His reflection met him there, two versions of himself, finally face to face. Not rivals, not illusions, just whole, and for once, honest. In his mind, a question rose, a quiet one, yet louder than anything he'd heard all night. If I woke up tomorrow with nothing, who would still look at me the way Maria looked at that old waiter? He didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing. It was time to live as if he had always been worthy of love, not just respect. Jonathan stood alone in that white, gleaming room, half his face lit by the harsh bathroom light wet. No music. Just the soft, steady sound of water dripping like the heart, slowly leaking through the first fracture in a wall long built to keep it in. Have you ever thought you understood only to realize you'd just been standing outside, watching life go by? If this scene reminded you of a part of yourself, share it, because someone out there is staring at their own reflection tonight, still trying to find the courage to truly see. Early morning. The villa was bathed in a soft, golden light, filtering gently through long windows draped in sheer white curtains. The weather was unusually beautiful, the sky higher, the garden still, as if waiting for something new. But the strangest thing wasn't outside, it was in the kitchen. The automatic coffee machine hummed quietly. A low, steady sound, careful and methodical, like the man operating it. Jonathan. He wore a slightly wrinkled shirt, hair uncombed, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His eyes were focused, as if managing a major deal. Except this time, he was doing something entirely foreign. He was making coffee. For someone other than himself. He opened the cabinet, fumbled with the water line, picked the wrong setting foam spilled over. He clumsily wiped it up, let out a dry laugh to no one. Maria walked in. She stopped at the kitchen entrance, still holding a dishcloth, 1 foot mid-step. The man once called a money machine was now wrestling with the simplest appliance. In the house, Jonathan turned. He caught her gaze and gave a small nod. No pride, no embarrassment, just a quiet admission. I'm learning. Maria didn't say anything. She walked to the table, placed the cloth down, and was about to leave when Jonathan spoke. Coffee, for you. I usually drink tea in the morning. I know, he said, but today, I want you to try something I made not because it's good, but because it's honest. Maria touched the cup, but didn't drink right away. You made this? I tried. A beat of silence. Maria looked at the cup as if it were a quiet offering wrapped in ceramic. You've never made anything in this kitchen for anyone. I know, Jonathan said, eyes steady. And I know that's not right. He pulled out a chair and sat not across from her, but beside her, not a position of power, but one of willingness. I've been thinking, he began, his voice measured. I don't want to provide for you. I don't want to make amends. I want to learn from you. Maria tilted her head as if unsure she heard him correctly. Learn what, exactly? How to be human, he said without hesitation. She looked at him for a long moment. When was the last time you did something for someone? Just because. The question dropped like the final drip of a slow-brewed coffee. Jonathan didn't answer right away. His hand tightened slightly around the cup handle. I don't remember, he admitted. Maria nodded, not to scold, but to acknowledge a first step. Just then, soft footsteps echoed from the stairs. Emily appeared, holding the white cat, hair a bit tousled, eyes still fogged with sleep. She paused when she saw her father, sitting beside Miss Maria, a cup of coffee between them, a quiet intimacy on the table. You made coffee? Emily asked, half skeptical. I did. Really? She turned to Maria. Is it drinkable? Maria smiled. It's passable. You should teach him how to make it better. If the student's willing, Maria said gently. Jonathan chuckled, tilting his head. I promise I'll listen, this time for real. Maria looked at him, then took a sip. Her face winced just slightly. Still bitter. But bitterness wakes you up. The words landed in the room like a small bell quiet, but enough to stir something that had been sleeping far too long. Jonathan looked down at his hands. They weren't used to holding a coffee cup this early. But this morning, they weren't just holding coffee. They were holding a beginning. 14th floor. The company's internal auditorium. A space once reserved only for high-level partners or quarterly report unveilings. Morning light streamed in through tall glass walls, casting soft reflections onto rows of white-draped chairs and a stage of pale wood. There was no event backdrop, no blinding LED screens, just a bare stage, a single standing microphone, and the front row unexpectedly labeled honored guests. The first people to take those seats did so with visible confusion. A silver-haired janitor with her uniform neatly pressed. A young security guard still sitting like he's standing, at attention. An elderly kitchen worker, his hands faintly scented with rinsed vegetables. A logistics staffer, keycard lanyard swinging on his chest. They glanced at each other and whispered, "Why are we sitting here?" Maybe. A mistake? At the back of the hall, Jonathan appeared. Alone, No assistant, no entourage. He wore a modest suit, no title pin. His gaze was clear but without its usual polished pride. He walked up the stage. No handheld mic, no music, just him, a low wooden podium, and a room waiting without knowing what for. Jonathan's opening speech. Today, I'm not announcing a project, handing out bonuses, not introducing new leadership. I just want to do something I should have done a long time ago, to call out the names I've forgotten, because I've spent too long listening to the sound of money and not enough time hearing the quiet footsteps that arrive here every morning. He paused for breath. I used to believe the spotlight belonged to leaders, but I was wrong. Some people light up everything from behind the scenes. He turned toward the wing. Please welcome Miss Maria Dawson. Maria steps out. She emerged slowly, wearing a soft gray dress, her hair tied up, no makeup, no script, just the quiet shock still flickering in her eyes. Applause broke out, tentative at first, then swelling from security staff to accounting, from IT to communications. Maria walked past the stairs, this time not with her head down, not avoiding eye contact, not rushing. She stood at the mic. No notes, no teleprompter. Just her voice steady, low, and real. I'm not used to this kind of light. I'm used to the light above the stove. I'm used to people giving orders, not asking me what I think. A beat, a row of heads lowered. I was once a teacher, then a single mother, then a housekeeper. I never imagined standing here. But today, I was called not to work, but to be heard. Thank you for seeing me. She looked at Jonathan, then down at the front row, people just like her. Thank you for listening to me instead of just giving me instructions. She bowed her head. The entire room stood. The applause wasn't choreographed, wasn't uniform, but it was real, deeply real. No one said a word, but in the eyes of those seated, something stirred, something hard to name. A former staffer, long dismissed for her lack of title, wiping her eyes behind a tight smile. A quiet intern rising to clap because his mother is a housekeeper too. Jonathan didn't return to the stage. He stepped down and stood beside the front row among the unnamed, clapping for the first teacher who never had a lectern. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through the thick glass walls of the top floor, casting a soft, golden haze across the room. Outside, the financial district bustled on as always, but in this room, time seemed to pause, holding its breath for a farewell. Jonathan sat alone behind the large wooden desk, a notebook open before him. The words he'd written that morning were now faint in the amber light. Community Learning Center, where people can learn without being judged. A knock at the door, 3 light, even taps. Familiar enough that Jonathan didn't need to look up. The door opened. Maria entered, calm and composed. She no longer wore the tailored dresses from last week's ceremony. No spotlight lit her silver hair. Today, she was simply herself, gray cardigan, modest knee-length skirt, worn flat shoes. She walked in, eyes clear but quiet. Jonathan stood gently, as if the room itself had to adjust to her presence. "You came," he began, but she spoke first, her voice soft, warm, and certain. "I came to say goodbye." Jonathan paused. A long silence hung between them, not of shock, but of something heavier, like water breaking through a dam. Finally, he exhaled and sank back into his chair, folding his hands on the desk. "I don't want you to leave." Maria nodded slightly, as if she'd expected that. "I know," she said, "but I don't stay just because someone wants me to." He turned the notebook toward her, resting his hand over a sketched-out plan he'd worked on all week. "I'm planning to open a community learning center," he said. "No publicity, no branding, no titles. I'll fund it, but stay out of the way. You could be the head, design the curriculum, hire the teachers, run it your way. It's all yours." Maria didn't reach for it. She looked at the notebook, then at him. Her voice was steady, clear, never vague. "You're doing a good thing," she said, "but you're doing it like someone used to handing out power." Jonathan frowned, tilting his head slightly. "I'm not trying to give power," he replied. "I'm trying to return something that society once took from you." Maria smiled faintly, not with scorn, not in mockery, just the kind of smile someone gives when they've heard many sincere offers before. "You know," she said, stepping toward the window where the light had cooled into amber, "I've spent my whole life living by what others thought was right, pitied for being widowed, praised for being resilient, but very rarely just left alone." She turned back to him, her eyes steady but not sharp. "If I accept, people will turn me into a symbol. Even if you don't mean it that way, they'll say, 'Oh, look at him, how kind. He made the housekeeper a principal. How touching.'" She paused. "I don't want to be part of anyone's story. I want to live my own." Jonathan stepped closer. He didn't protest. He simply looked at her with something that resembled reverence. Pure, unvarnished. "So, where will you go?" he asked. "Not far," Maria answered. "Just a corner in the basement of an old church. I'll start a class there. No signboard, no funding, no applause. Just a few worn desks, a few kids who've been turned away. There, I don't need to inspire anyone. I just need to teach." Jonathan nodded, slowly, deeply, like a man finally understanding what he'd been trying to grasp all along. "I respect that," he said. Maria held his gaze, saying nothing more. But in her eyes was something unmistakable, not forgiveness, not gratitude. Recognition. Between two people who had once stood on opposite ends of the ladder, now meeting on equal ground. "I know you've changed," she said, "and that's exactly why I'm leaving. I'm not going because there's nothing left to do, but because I'm no longer bound by anyone's guilt or kindness." Then she turned to the door, did not look back. But just before it closed, her voice floated backlight, but firm. "Thank you for learning how to let someone leave without needing permission." Early morning. A thin layer of mist still clung to the lawn just outside the villa gates. The sky wore a shade of silver-gray, not gloomy, but soft enough to mute the light, as if the entire world had stepped back to make space for something quiet and personal. Maria stepped out through the front door, pulling behind her an old fabric suitcase, its frayed corner whispering of years past. The wheels made a faint sound as they rolled across the stone threshold. She wore a pale gray coat, a light scarf draped loosely around her neck, and simple Fletcher familiar style. Modest, certain, needing no justification. The villa gates stood open. Maria walked steadily, not slowly, not rushed just enough to cross. The yard she had crossed 1,000 times before, but today would be the last. Soft footsteps echoed behind her. Emily came running dressed in her school uniform, hair neatly braided, backpack nearly too big for her frame. She didn't speak. She simply wrapped her small arms tightly around Maria's waist from behind. Maria turned and knelt, pulling the child close. Her arms hugged gently, as if trying to hold on to the warmth just a little longer. Emily buried her face into Maria's shoulder, her voice breaking slightly. "Miss Maria, I'll come to your class every Sunday, okay?" Maria smiled, nodded, her hand gently stroking the girl's back. "I'll always be waiting for you." "I'll miss you." "I know." A kiss landed softly on Emily's forehead, the same kind. Maria had given through long nights of fever or after teary school days, but this one carried something more. A quiet goodbye no one dared to name. Emily stepped back. Maria stood up. Without looking back, she pulled the suitcase through the open gate, her small figure fading into the silver mist of the street beyond. Upstairs in his office, Jonathan sat before the surveillance monitor. The gate camera displayed the last image of Maria just as she disappeared from frame. Emily still stood at the doorstep, her hands gripping her backpack straps, not chasing, not crying, but watching, and her eyes were saying goodbye. Jonathan's hand hovered over the zoom button, an instinct to bring the image closer, just a little more. But he didn't press it. His fingers rested there for a moment, then dropped. Moments later, he stood, put on his coat, and left the office without a word. Cut to a quiet street corner not far from the villa, near an old bookstore. The morning mist lingered, and the sun had just started brushing the pavement with a thin golden ribbon. Maria stood by the curb, phone to her ear, ordering the first supplies for her little classroom in the church basement. She didn't notice the black car pulling up behind her. Jonathan stepped out, in his Honda small bouquet of white chrysanthemums. No wrapping, no ribbon, no card. Maria turned when she heard his footsteps. They looked at each other. No smiles, but no sadness either. Only understanding, quiet and complete. Jonathan extended the flowers, both hands, gently. Maria took them, bowed her head, whispered a thank you too soft for sound. There was no goodbye. No hug, no promises. Only a long, unwavering gaze, like two people standing at a crossroads, each ready to walk a different path. Neither, one holding the other back. A moment later, Maria turned and walked away. Jonathan, too, turned and returned to his car. They didn't look back, but both knew the other would always remain, somewhere, in a part of life that no one else could ever replace. On the passenger seat, Jonathan laid down his notebook. On the final page, hastily penciled in shaky script, one sentence stood alone. Love is not holding someone back. It's knowing when they need to go. 1 year later, morning in the impoverished West Side suburb began with the bright laughter of children, the rattle of bicycle wheels over dirt roads, and the familiar call of a street vendor selling sticky rice at the corner market. The narrow alley leading to a vacant lot behind an old church was still damp with mist, but alive with color and sound. What used to be a forgotten parking area had become an open-air classroom. No roof, no fans, no projectors, just a makeshift wooden board. Propped up by metal frames, a few rows of cheap plastic chairs, a wobbly bookshelf tucked in the corner, and the children, 7, 8 years old, some barefoot, others in muddy shirts, giggling hysterically as one boy misread the word dignity as chicken dignity. In the middle of them sat a silver-haired woman, slender, wearing an old button-up, shirt and a frayed beige scarf, a folded book in hand, reading glasses perched low, a smile that never quite left her face. Mariah. That same gaze. That same gentle voice that somehow kept a swarm of children utterly still, as if under a spell. No one recorded it, no cameras captured it, but everything there was real because she believed it mattered. At the end of the alley, a black SUV pulled up. The window rolled down halfway. A pair of eyes watched from the driver's seat. Jonathan. Sleeves rolled, tie draped loosely over his shoulder, expression still. In his hand, a postcard scribbled in a child's handwriting. Miss Maria's class is so fun. She teaches baking and even how to write thank you notes. I'll invite you to class for my birthday. Emily, through the windshield, Jonathan watched Maria's every movement. The way she gently patted the head of the child who had misread. The way she wiped the board with a cloth. The way she knelt down on the dirt to write the first letter of the word respect. He reached for the door handle. Fingers touched the chrome. But then he stopped, not out of hesitation, but recognition. Some places don't need you to step inside for you to still be part of something good. He stayed seated, quiet. He set the postcard on the dashboard right where his coffee usually sat. A breeze drifted through the car carrying the children's laughter, chicken dignity. Jonathan chuckled, softly. Then looked toward Maria one last time, and in that moment, a thought came to him, clear as a line etched straight into the soul. He used to think dignity was something you had to prove. But Maria had never needed to prove it. She simply lived it. The camera pans slowly to the chalkboard at the front of the class, where a crooked line of white letters reads, "Dignity isn't about where you sit, it's about how you treat others." Maria didn't know she was being watched from afar, but she kept teaching, kept writing, kept smiling, because she understood. Kindness is a choice. It doesn't need applause. It only needs to be done. The story of Jonathan and Maria ends, but not really, because somewhere, in the quiet folds of everyday life, there are still Maria's sewing, letters in silence, and Jonathan's relearning how to be human. If you've followed this journey to the end, thank you for listening, instead of just scrolling by. If this story stilled something in you, share it with someone who might also need the reminder, dignity isn't given. It's something we hold, and don't forget to follow this channel, so we can keep walking through stories not of perfect people, but of those who are simply trying to be better every single day. The end. But not really, because the real story begins with how you choose to live. After reading this last line,